This growth on the face, half plant, half... Look at this. Look what it's done. The whole tissue structure's eaten away. The bone's powder.
Well, it takes care of my supper tonight.
It's coming for you. Nothing can destroy it. You can't escape it. From beyond the grave, from out of space, a horror horde of monster mutants walks the earth. Welcome, guys and ghouls, to Monster Craze Memoirs, a generational podcast about B-movies. I am your host, Ian Garcia, and with me, as always, is my father, Rocco.
How you doing?
I had asked you about your formative experiences of watching horror movies on television, and you had mentioned The Wolfman as a particularly formative example for you because it sort of scared you so much. Either you couldn't finish it or your mother wouldn't allow you to finish it because you were getting too excitable. Maybe it is a stale point, but I think it's not just quaint. I still think that there is, beyond a novelty, I think there is a significance in discussing how these movies, because they are as far as movies go at a certain time, they have a potential to really get under the skins of impressionable kids. And
Well, it's not impressionable. I think the fact you're just young. I think I was 6 or 7. I don't think it's a matter of being impressionable. Now you look at The Wolfman and say, it's nice, it's good. Then you appreciate all the finer points of how the movie was put together. But no, when you're younger, you don't see that. But I remember The Creeping Unknown being, I think, also a television movie.
the American title of the movie is The Creeping Unknown, and that's actually, it's also slightly edited. Not a lot was edited out that was dramatically changes the plot, but the original British title of the movie is The Quatermass Experiment. But I remembered you saying at several points throughout watching the movie, I don't remember this at all.
Yeah,
And
I think that you have to remember that back then, it was commercialized television. So you had commercial breaks in between various segments. So I wouldn't be surprised if some of the stuff was edited out just in general.
it was a long time ago.
It was a long time ago.
And you're seeing it in a very different medium. Like, it's not on a square, small, black and white, fuzzy TV.
Right.
Now you're seeing it in a restored print of it.
Correct. You see all the finer aspects of the filmmaking, and you're older. Your perspective is changing. It's older. You're older now.
But as we've been doing this survey, as it were, of these older movies, what would you say is your main takeaway as an adult, as far as, because these movies were a pretty big formative influence on you, and I wonder what your big takeaways are now that you're an adult and revisiting, in terms of maybe having a more critical understanding of the quality of certain films, that it wasn't necessarily all the time just you being a kid who was just interested in the content, that there is something about the form of certain films that makes them stand out.
For this particular film, there are a couple of qualities about the film, but also a couple of things that irritate me to some extent. For example, the notion, and this is pretty much, it's interesting whether or not the writers that wrote the screenplay for this, or the script, had the intention of attracting two kinds of people that are willing to go to the unknown, and others saying that we're crossing into territories that are forbidden. Also, the tone of that science is arrogant, and that science is, or exploration is arrogant, or science, or both. It's unconcerned about the welfare of the world and things like that. And there are a couple of things, those things kind of irritate me, maybe. And maybe a number of films where the doctors come off, or the scientists come off, as being both arrogant or unaware or fickle about what's going on here. That's what I want to say about The Creeping Unknown. But in terms of the film, I thought its linear content is more appealing to me. And also, I think the way it was put together, I don't think there's much of a wasted segment in this film.
No, it's a very efficient,
Yeah.
done film. I guess we'll just summarize quickly. We watched 2 films for this episode because they were released in the United States as a double feature. We watched the second bill of the double feature first, just because it was actually made first. We watched the Quatermass Experiment, as I already said, and then we also watched a American horror movie called The Black Sleep. And unlike, I think, From Hell It Came and The Disembodied, which are, while they have superficial similarities, like taking place in the jungle and involving black magic or of some kind, there weren't a lot of themes between them that dovetailed together. Whereas I would say with the Quatermass Experiment and The Black Sleep, they do dovetail quite nicely, especially in regards to what you're talking about, which is this common motif that we're seeing emerging throughout these films, particularly ones made in European and Western countries, of scientists being either the unwitting or the amoral vehicles of some kind of horror or disaster.
Right. Not immoral, not anything, but just like you said, amoral is a good term for it. If you want to accept it, they're ambivalent, or they just ignore the consequences, or they're unaware of the consequences. But there are always consequences. Like, I think that this film is particularly a good film. I think it's something that a lot of
the Quatermass Experiment specifically.
Over a lot of things, people should see this one. I think its kernel has a lot of value.
It is effectively disturbing in a lot of respect.
It is a very disturbing picture. It is a very disturbing picture, but I think I always want to credit the writers for having such a vivid imagination. But a vivid imagination that follows. It isn't like you have vivid imagination where you have these pastiches of different abnormalities that occur in a picture. But here it looks like there's a linear progression that's real well thought out, and on top of that, I think the actual filming looks good in this film.
The cinematography is very well done.
There are a couple like the fact that the rocket, like as I mentioned to you in private discussion, the rocket lands on its nose first and somehow remarkably is intact. We'll let that slide.
It's like a leaning tower of Pisa.
That's probably one of the few things, other than the fact that this particular Quatermass has broad range of power. We could talk about that.
Scientist.
Scientist, or whatever he is, a compilation of different people within this one person. Maybe he's a scientist, an engineer, whatever he is.
Scientist here can basically be a catch-all for knowledgeable guy who uses his brain to get a lot of things done, and in the sort of generic
also an ego associated with it, and a blind ambition. But it's not totally blind. I mean, there's some, obviously, he does illustrate concern for the individual, and it's not concern for the individual because of what he can learn from them, but concern from the individual in terms of safety. But there is also that aspect that he wants to learn what's happened to this one individual that did manage to survive. The other themes that we talked about briefly is that there are broad cross-cutting themes in a lot of these pictures. So you can start with the Earth being imploded with astronomical objects that contain the particular creatures, or whatever you call it. We talked about the blob, for example, an example where a meteor comes and it contains the actual blob. The Invasion of the Body Snatchers, the original film, in which the person comments on the fact that seeds fell out from space into a farmer's field, that kind of thing. The other cross-cutting thing that you see is where it isn't us, we invade a particular area, but it's not an invasion, it's just the unknown, where we intersect.
We kind of unwittingly stumble into a space where we're not invited, and we receive some kind of...
Invitation's not... Is it an invitation, or is it just the way it is? That there are parasites in the astronomical universe?
Well, there are just these natural cosmic forces which are beyond our ability to categorize or define them. And so it comes off almost, especially when it's paired with the hubris of the scientist characters, it becomes effectively a kind of punishment. It's almost like, it's the classic fable of the Tower of Babel, of man, stretching into the ethereal space where he's just not meant to go, playing God, etc., etc. We've managed in this series so far to concentrate on films that were released in the mid to late 50s, and it's turned out to be a very good starting point, because we are now watching two movies that are basically at a perfect pinpoint of a sea change in terms of the explicit and morbid content that is considered acceptable. And it wasn't just in terms of the explicitness of the films. There is an element of explicitness, as in the Quatermass experiment, we see close-up shots of masticated bodies after they've been attacked by this monster from space. In The Black Sleep, we get the shots and sounds of a brain surgery. But it's not just the explicitness, it's also the morbid topics of these films, whether it's the transformation of a human into a monster in the case of the Quatermass experiment, or the complementary example in The Black Sleep where there's this scientist who is wantonly experimenting on the brains of live people in order to figure out how to isolate and perform systematic surgery on the brain of his comatose wife.
Right.
And in the process creating these, their minds have been mutilated.
That's correct.
And as a result of that, the person that now exists in this shell is no longer the same person, because it gets into and that's what I mean by
that's right, the transformation.
Like, and
right.
This is the thing, is that it what I meant by it not just being the explicitness of the content. This isn't just someone performing a magic voodoo spell to transport one soul into another, and it's not simply a mad scientist cutting out one brain and putting it into another body. It is indeed this much more morbid scenario of one person's consciousness being mutilated and thus replaced by this horrific prisoner within a shell.
Right.
And I think it's
a dual prison, right?
Yeah.
Prison within his body, but probably not recognizing what the former self was like.
There's a character who's played by Lon Chaney. He's one of these guys who has been experimented on by the mad surgeon played by Basil Rathbone. Because for whatever reason, Basil Rathbone doesn't just decide to put his victims / subjects out of their misery. He continues to let them to live, and in fact he has this weird justification where he says,
to remind me of my failure, to remind me to work and study even harder, so that such surgical disasters could be prevented.
But really specifically with Lon Chaney's character, not only is he living in the castle where this surgeon operates, but also his daughter is living there. There are several moments in the film where he just flies into a kind of inexplicable rage and attacks his own daughter and starts strangling her. And despite the fact that I don't necessarily think the movie itself, at least not compared to the Quatermass experiment, I don't think it's as well made. That is something that I have never really seen in an older film like this. Just something
That's right.
that is
there are some elements that are quite disturbing in the whole film. Yes.
Just to hold that concept in your mind of like, what if your father was not your father anymore? And it's
right. Well, where do we see that again? Again, cross-cutting themes. We see that in
Invasion of the Body Snatchers.
Where it's not my father, we're complaining to the psychiatrist. It's not my father, it's someone else. Also
released in 1956. So these are definitely themes, these morbid themes are definitely on the mind of the moment. But that's important. It is so important to stress these elements because, again, from our modern day context, those things might not appear to be so exceptional. But at the time that these movies were made, these were extreme encroachments onto what was considered acceptable to depict in these movies. Not just explicitness, but just basic topics of what is like a dignified subject for a movie that, again, most people understand is supposed to be watched by children.
Do you have any notion of whether there was any editing when they originally were shown?
I imagine that there would have to be, because, it's not just a question of whether independent censorship bodies like the Production Code Authority in America or the official government body in the United Kingdom, the British Board of Film Censors. It's not just about necessarily the cuts that they demand in order to give a film a certain rating. You also have to consider how individual states and local governments also have their own censorship bodies and their own standards. And then, of course, exhibitors themselves often had incredible leeway to just cut out whatever they didn't think was appropriate. In my research into these films, I did not find that there was a tremendous amount of editing done to The Black Sleep upon its release. A lot of that might just have been a function of the fact that these movies are not made by big-name studios. They are being made at a time where, again, this is post-1948 Paramount decision, where the major studios in the United States have been demonopolized and divested of their vertical integration of production and distribution. So they cannot have their own theaters. Those theaters need to be operated separately. And so these movies aren't necessarily being made predominantly by big-name studios. What has happened is that smaller independent studios, both distributors and producers, have moved in to fill this void of cheap content that can make a quick amount of money. And what we see is the sort of beginnings of that really pushing the content of these films further, because now they're not necessarily, not that they weren't encumbered by censorship, but they're more free than major studios existing outside of that sort of milieu. The Creeping Unknown, I know that version of the Quatermass experiment, as it was released in the United States, it was slightly edited. For instance, there's a scene in which they discover the dead body of a chemist who has been killed by the astronaut who is possessed by the alien force in the film. And when they discover the body, like all the bodies, they discover it's been completely drained of blood. And in the original version, when the body is being turned over, we get this very shocking, for the time, close-up view of the victim's face. This just skeletal, dehydrated cadaver. But then in the Creeping Unknown, in the American edit, they removed that close-up, so it just immediately cuts to the horrified reaction shots. But otherwise, there are other close-ups of dead faces that are kept, so it might just be like a simple question of, okay, you can have a certain number of faces of corpses, but this is the third one. Okay, you can't have the third one. You've had enough.
It's kind of funny, because I seem to remember, I don't remember the scene of all the animals that are...
Yeah, there's a scene in the Quatermass experiment where the possessed astronaut goes to a zoo and basically runs rampant. We don't see any explicit... Again, we don't see the explicit attack, but then after, there is this very morbid, investigation of the scene in which you see all these dead animals just strewn out all over the zoo, and it's really... It does get under your skin. These were trends in the content of these sorts of movies that contemporary censors, I don't even think that they were necessarily prepared to handle. And I'm going to use the British Board of Film Censors as a particular example, because historically the British censors have been slightly more progressive than American censors. American censors tended to have a unilateral moratorium on specific kinds of content, whether it's violence, though especially sexuality, and criminal behavior. But in the British context, there's historically far less emphasis on explicit content per se than on the extent of morbidity, whether it seems like the film is gratuitously...
It's more efficient editing and not
Well, it's still censorship, but it's a censorship that is couched in a framework of saying, is this content so morbid that it will produce legitimately unpleasant feelings in the public and potentially present a social harm? When The Black Sleep, when the script was presented to the British Board of Film Censors, because that's what you had to do back in those days. It wasn't just you finished a film and then you got what the cuts you needed to make. Oftentimes studios would give the scripts to the censors beforehand so that they wouldn't waste a bunch of time shooting stuff that they couldn't include. And the BBFC, which is now renamed the British Board of Film Classification, because of course censorship as a term has fallen out of favor in liberal Western societies. But they talk, the censors were very adamant that in the scene in the film, the most explicit one where we see the Basil Rathbone's character performing the brain surgery, they were not just adamant that there shouldn't be a close-up shot of the exposed brain in the skull of the victim. They were not just adamant that there shouldn't be any visible fluid. They also specifically said, you also can't, have sounds. Even if you're just showing Basil Rathbone cutting something which is totally off-screen, you can't show the sounds of cutting. When he's putting the skull cap into something, you can't hear the sound of the skull cap hitting something. And it should be noted, they basically completely ignored the censors.
Well, they did, because I remember that being in the film when I was younger. So that those clearly were still in place.
And again, so you did see The Black Sleep when
I
you
did.
were younger.
After I saw it, I did remember it. Go ahead. I want to continue your thought.
But that gets down to it, is that you have to, in order to appreciate these movies, it's not necessarily it's not necessarily imperative that you understand these things in order to appreciate the movies, because I do feel they are both well made in their own right. But especially for the time, even these minor things, like showing a surgery, hearing the sound of a body part being put somewhere, these are things that people very rarely, if ever, saw in commercial films. And as a result, these things could be incredibly disturbing and incredibly potent. And it creates this risky scenario for the filmmakers in a lot of cases, because
it's also the intent. So
yes.
The intent's important. For example, if you look at Not as a Stranger, which stars Robert Mitchum, and again, Lon Chaney Jr. plays his father in a very brief scene in the beginning. They show an open heart surgery, obviously from file footage.
Stock footage
was interjected within the film. There, obviously, the intent is not horror. It's not melodrama. It's
almost educational. There's a motivation to it. Whereas if you're a censor watching one of these,
I think it's 1958. I'm not sure about the Not as a Stranger. But that's not a horror film. That's a regular drama.
And I should say, I understand from another perspective that it would be easy for us to just say, well, obviously these film censors are just getting in the way of creative expression. These films, despite the overtness of their content for the time, producers of these films and distributors and exhibitors, especially in America, would not adjust their advertising tactics to the notion that, well, these are definitely more morbid, therefore we should aim for a higher audience. They were continuing to push the boundaries of these incredibly, for the time, disturbing content and themes, but their bottom dollar motivation and their bottom dollar strategy was to get kids to see them in a kind of reckless manner, and it's illustrated quite perfectly with the Quatermass experiment, aka the Creeping Unknown. The way the title is spelled is with an X, very boldly put in the experiment part. There's no E in experiment. It begins with a giant X, and on posters for the film and in the title, the X is highly emphasized. Now, this wasn't just a stylization. The reason this was emphasized was because the Quatermass experiment was intended by the producers of the film, Hammer Films, to be an X-rated movie, which meant that in the UK, people under 16, exhibitors were discouraged from letting people under 16 even see the movie. So think about that for the time, the Quatermass experiment was so lurid, the country that produced it, the official censors believed, and the filmmakers were conscious in trying to do, that this is only a movie that's appropriate for adults. This is a movie that's only appropriate for people of a certain age. You can't show this to children. Meanwhile, in the United States, you have the Quatermass experiment and the Black Sleep just being wantonly shown because not these films were more or less released unrated in the American context,
Right.
because they're not that ratings didn't exist. The Production Code Authority had a much more black and white approval or disapproval system, but because the major studios who had independently created the Production Code Authority, because they had been divested of so much of their monopolistic power in the film industry, it was now much easier for smaller studios and independent ones to push boundaries. And I think it is more of a urban legend. Not even an urban legend, because we do know the factual origin, but it's an anecdote from the American release of the double feature of The Black Sleep and The Creeping Unknown. I'm going to tell you guys the brief story of a child named Stuart Cohen. He was a 9-year-old from the suburbs of Chicago, Illinois, who went with some friends to the Lake Theater on Sunday, October 28th, 1956, to see a horror movie double feature consisting of The Black Sleep and The Creeping Unknown. Early into the second half of the double bill, Stewart's friends later told investigators that he began murmuring and acting weirdly before finally collapsing on the floor. He was taken out into the lobby of the theater, where he ultimately died. An autopsy performed by the deputy coroner concluded that Stewart, whose heart was smaller than average, had died due to heart collapse after extraordinary tension while watching a movie. In other words, the official reasoning for Stewart's death was that he died of fright. In 1957, Stewart's mother sued for $25,000, alleging negligent maliciousness on the part of the distributors of the film, United Artists, and the management of the theater who booked the double feature. The suit also claimed that these movies were, quote, horrendous, hideous, and inherently dangerous to the safety and well-being of children.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but let me ask you, was she awarded?
No, I don't think it went
Well,
anywhere.
the point is that, I mean, even that seeing someone die with a small heart and with myocardial problems, like thick wall syndromes, I mean, it's not unusual. I mean, athletes die all the time on a training field.
Yeah,
and no one sues the coaches for dropping dead.
No,
I mean,
look. Here's the thing. I'm not attempting to say that there's a legitimacy to the lawsuit. I'm saying that. Yeah. But I am. But I do think it's an anecdote that points out two distinct things. Even if there was obviously a special case in terms of Stuart Cohen, who was really just in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was in the wrong physical condition. I think I can take the deputy coroner's word for it. Oh no, that was what it was alluded. That emphasizes, for anyone who's doubtful, for the time. So he had sat through the entirety of The Black Sleep, this movie that has shots of exposed brains and skulls leaking fluid, of living people having their brains mutilated by a mad scientist, of those people then being kept as prisoners in a castle, of a daughter who is constantly being attacked by a monster in the form of her father. And then he goes into the second half of this double bill, and the first thing that happens is we hear this, it's this dark night scene, and these two lovers are in a hayfield just making out with each other, and you hear the screeching, howling sound. You don't know what it is. It could be a plane that's crashing. It could be a bomb. They look up and see it, but they don't know what it is. They immediately run, and then, of course, what turns out to be the rocket that Quatermass has designed and sent up into space crashes. The accumulation of this sort of tension, and really of just well-done horror filmmaking, was unprecedented for the time, and was definitely enough that it has a material effect. This isn't just the moral panickers of the contemporary society imagining things. There is something very real going on in terms of how movies are changing. Of course, with the Quatermass experiment, it was produced by Hammer Films, and Hammer Films, before they had made the Quatermass experiment, they had made two science fiction movies before, but they had never...
Right.
They had been mostly known as a studio that did low-budget crime and comedy movies. The Quatermass Experiment was their first huge international hit, and so that influenced them becoming the studio that horror fans know today, which is to say specifically a studio where the content of their movies was much more violent, much more explicit, had a lot more sexual tension and sexual content. And of course, eventually they introduced the novelty of color film, which introduces a whole new, unprecedented dimension of luridness to it. And in the case of American films of the time, the economic imperatives for these smaller studios to push back against censors in terms of what could be shown in film leads to an incremental moving of the Overton window of public tolerance in terms of content, but it also produces a kind of ghoulish disengagement from any notion that what we're doing could potentially be unnecessarily gratuitous or harmful to people. And I'll especially mention at the anecdote of William Castle's Macabre, which was released in 1958. William Castle was a filmmaker who definitely rose to prominence during this period of horror movies being increasingly morbid and being increasingly explicitly morbid about wearing on their sleeves that this is about you getting your kicks by just scaring yourself silly. Right. And what he did for Macabre, one of his promotional gimmicks was that all attendees received a certificate for a $1,000 life insurance policy from Lloyd's of London. Now, I don't know if William Castle knew
I did.
that
I wish I kept mine, yes.
Oh, you got one?
Sure.
My God.
Sure.
So how was Macabre? Did it live up to the life insurance policy?
I don't remember the movie.
We should watch it. We need to revisit Castle in general.
But more than one film
did the same thing,
and it was advertised in a newspaper under the
And sometimes it wouldn't necessarily be an insurance policy. It would be like a free burial. Like you'd have there'd be coffins.
I think it was mostly insurance, and I remember seeing it like as a banner across the bottom of the broadside that was printed in the paper.
There might be actors dressed up as like EMTs.
More people went.
Yeah, because obviously that's the point, and it was an incredibly effective marketing strategy. Because on one level, you're letting people in on the joke,
right?
That we're not taking. There's a tongue-in-cheekness that comes also with this pushing of content, but I do want to say, like, I don't think William Castle or any of other of these gimmick filmmakers were conscious of the Stuart Cohen death. But I do think that it does suggest a kind of ghoulishness. Almost weird in a way because it almost parallels the ambivalent scientist characters of these movies. That their pursuit of pushing these boundaries always comes at the expense of the public. That there is something materially that's being lost through this push, in this case, really just for cynical capitalization upon the most impressionable people in a society. But so let's quickly summarize the plots of both films. The Quatermass Experiment is a adaptation of a 6-episode BBC miniseries by the same name, which was written by Nigel Neal. It was adapted by Hammer, who hired Val Guest. So it's basically an abridged version of a TV show. We haven't seen the TV show, so we can't speak on the respective differences between them. But as far as the movie itself, it begins with a rocket ship crashing in rural England. We then learn that the rocket ship has been built by a scientist by the name of...
Again, I keep coming back. Do we know he's a scientist or just an engineer or the head of science?
He's definitely a scientist. His name is Professor Bernard Quatermass.
Okay.
He's actually played by an American American actor in the film because it would become a common practice for Hammer. Again, this was a very good touchstone for them as a studio because it would start a lot of their typical practices in terms of how these films were marketed abroad. Professor Bernard Quatermass, he was a Britisher in the original TV series, but here he's inexplicably an American scientist operating with all of this impunity in the United Kingdom. He's played by Brian Dunleavy, and he's pretty much cast not just because he's actually a pretty good actor in the role. He gives but also clearly so that it would give a big enough name that the American distributors could put that on a poster and, make it accessible to American audiences.
Or sellable, right.
Right. But we should talk about Brian Dunleavy's casting in this film. He is not at all this stereotype of an effete, detached, or cloistered scientist. If anything, he comes off more as like a general of a kind.
Sure, he's a militaristic kind of scientist.
Yeah.
In a way. It's really funny how it's this American with, like you said, free range in Britain. And it brings up all these ideas of how we saved Britain during the war and how we overcame Britain in 1776. I mean, it's so funny. There's all these.
Yeah, there's this.
I mean, this is the way I think about it. I don't think it's deliberate.
No, I don't. I don't know if it's still. I think I think part of
the British look like lackeys. They look like they have no stakes in the game. Like they're just.
Well, that's the thing. Well, but it does make you ask the question of because it's this thing of what is this American rocket scientist doing operating in the United Kingdom, and that's the thing. Quatermass is a rocket scientist. He has launched a 3-manned rocket into space, which it successfully achieves orbit. They lose contact with the rocket, and it crash lands, and so now but he's based in the UK, and that's the thing but it does get to this interesting dynamic that you bring up, is that this is a British movie in which there is just this inexplicable American scientist who is absolutely a brutish.
Right.
Who doesn't act like a scientist. He doesn't act, he's not polite, he's very overt, he's very insulting to people, he's casually dismissive, he always takes charge of a situation, and basically just dares anyone to stop him. But the interesting thing is that no one really stops him.
I'm Quatermass. I'll be in charge from here on, Inspector.
Can't say I'm sorry about that. What's the next move?
We can't do anything right now. Not until that cools off.
How long will that be, sir?
I would say 3 or 4 hours at least.
You won. This is Marsh. Do you hear me?
Over. We've been there for 4 hours.
I suppose you'd like me to open it up right now, huh? One blast of air in against that heat would incinerate them.
Some reporters here from London, so they'd like some facts.
They'll get some later.
They'll get some now. Bring them on, Major.
Don't you think we ought to find out a few more ourselves first?
Bring them on, Major.
Are you hearing me, Q1?
There's no authority that really ever intervenes. Even the British police, even Scotland Yard, they really don't lift a finger to...
And when they do break his rule by taking the thing to the hospital, is where it escapes, which is really funny. The one time where he insists...
all three. So they get inside the rocket. 2 of the astronauts have inexplicably disappeared, despite the fact that their suits are all locked together, implying that they were being worn when they disappeared. One of the astronauts has survived. His name is Victor Caroon. He's played by British actor Richard Wordsworth, and he is in a total state of disassociation, or what we think is disassociation, that he maybe has some trauma, but he's also starting to show signs of transformation, which Quatermass is slowly learning. Quatermass's characterization is very interesting because he is completely consumed by this notion that his pursuit of knowledge is the most noble endeavor you could possibly engage in, and anybody who stands in the way of that is a fool who just isn't ready. But the context in which it's portrayed, Victor Caroon is basically, he has some sympathy for Caroon, or at least affects some empathy for him. But Karun himself is quickly just becoming a prisoner in his own transforming body and his own transforming mind. He spends the most of the first act of the movie just sitting in a chair, gripping it, like as if he's like fighting internally this massive transformation within him. And
or he's fighting whatever, or it's taking over his body, so the thing is starting to...
So we get this
Which is very interesting,
yeah.
because in more modern terms, just bring this in as a scientist, and people probably listening to this already know that there are various, and I brought this up with you, that you should write a script about this. Maybe I shouldn't even say it because I don't want to give it away.
No, give it
I might as well
away.
give it away.
Maybe
But,
one of our listeners will put pen to
but,
paper.
But there are insects and there are animals that are taken over by molds, and it gets into their brain. And exactly what they do is these animals or these ants will grip the plant at the top of the plant and die there as the spores of the fungus break through the body and spread the spores all over the canopy.
And sometimes I do know that there are some forms of fungus or parasitic fungus that actually, particularly snails and slugs, what they will do is that they will have the snail go out, just like you say, onto the precipice of a leaf or a stick.
So it gets eaten.
So it gets eaten by a bird, and then the life cycle of the fungus continues as it breeds inside the digestion of the...
It's really interesting how this, but it's amazing how art imitates what happens in life. And
it's sort of a forerunner to Alien, isn't it? It's sort of a forerunner to this idea of of a kind of insemination, as it were.
Sure.
Because just to spoil it, it turns out what's happening to Karun
doesn't matter. We have to watch it anyway.
Is that he's slowly being transformed into an alien monster that, as it grows, will finally reach a point where it will divide itself and multiply asexually infinitely until it just assimilates the entire Earth.
What's interesting about this picture, before you get off on it, is that I think their use of off-screen continuity is almost perfect. Like, a lot of times you don't see
implied stuff, yeah. There's a lot of implied horror.
You don't see them as. You see a painted slime thing, like you just mentioned, Motlocks, when they go up a wall, they do that, right? They make this slimy track. It's very interesting that a lot of things are off-screen, but you have a full concept, and it's
Val Guest was a big believer.
It's just as frightening.
Yeah, there's a lot.
What you don't see is frightening, right?
Yeah, I think that's the thing. We're in terms of the technical craftsmanship of the film, of why it's so good and why it's obviously, the Black Sleep is okay, but the Quatermass Experiment is really a masterclass because the vast majority of the morbid content in it is implied, whether it's in terms of but then there are very deliberate moments where it does become explicit, and the explicitness is not to emphasize a violent action. The explicitness is to emphasize the consequence,
right?
Whether it's a dead person or a dead animal or what have you. And what it also does is let us.
It's not like Caltiki, or it's not like The Blob, where the things get consumed by it.
Well, it's not like Caltiki where you literally see a guy's bleeding skull as he's being absorbed by the...
So, you're right. You're absolutely right. But I just thought that there's something that was pointed out here. That's really good filmmaking, is that they could eliminate a lot of what would be sort of numbing to a person. This has actually worked to its advantage as a film.
Yeah. It's so...
And it helps the censorship.
I think...
It gets around censorship,
It does. Like, if you can distract enough people with implied horror, maybe they'll miss the fact that, you just showed you've shown 3 different close-ups of blood-drained faces in this movie. But I think if the concept weren't as well honed down, it also wouldn't be as effective, because what the implied violence also does is it not only makes what's explicit more effective, it also allows you to focus more on the character-driven elements of the story, which is how we got into this tangent.
That's exactly
which is the duality between Quatermass as the scientist and Karun as this man who is being slowly transformed by basically something that Quatermass is responsible for. There's especially
good point.
So let's get into not the explicit content, but some of the morbid concepts that are evident in Karun's arc as a character as he's transforming. In the scene where he escapes from the hospital, how it's set up is really interesting, because he fixates his attention on a cactus, which is sitting in the windowsill, and suddenly, for the first time in the film, he gets up almost in a somnambulant way, and he walks over to the cactus, and he suddenly just slams his fist down on the cactus.
All off screen.
All off screen. So what we instead see is his visceral pain, and it's not just
shattering of the cup against the wall.
Of the cup against the wall. And so we learn that he has assimilated the cactus to a certain degree, but the emphasis of the scene is not on the assimilation, it's on him harming himself in a way, that there's this war going on within him where there's this this one being that is just trying to break out, and there's him who is fighting it with all his might. And it does follow up, because later, when we mention the chemist who is killed in the film, and by chemist I mean the British word for pharmacist, when the pharmacist is killed, what Karun does, he doesn't immediately just go into the chemist and start and attack him. What he first does is he goes up to the chemical chest and is basically just smashing bottles. And the chemist, it's a very macabre scene, because immediately the chemist sees that Karun is in pain and tries to help him. But then Karun is inevitably taken over by this force, and he assimilates the blood of the chemist. And then, so finally, when Quatermass and Inspector Lomax, who is played by Jack Warner, he's the Scotland Yard policeman.
Let me interject here.
But wait, let me just finish this point.
All right, go ahead.
They come in, and Quatermass's British assistant, Dr. Gordon Briscoe, played by David King Wood, he speculates that the reason that Karun came to the chemist was that he was looking for a way to kill himself.
Right, or speed up the reaction.
And so
it's not quite clear, right?
It's not quite clear, but here's a good bit of trivia. In the original BBC series, the monster that Karun becomes is defeated not by them. What happens in this movie, they basically just hotwire it to some electricity they basically cook it to death with electricity. In the original BBC series, Quatermass, obviously a completely differently characterized Quatermass, who is a British person and much more intellectual, more stereotypically effete and intellectual, he appeals to Karun's still lingering psyche and gets him to kill himself. In the original series, these are all elements that are leading up to a spectacular finale, whereas in this one, it's like you're saying, we don't know, but
what was intent,
but it's conveyed in that performance that, yes, the monster wants one thing, but Karun wants another. And this is a thing. It's like, what other B movies or monster movies at the time do you know that implicated suicide?
No.
Like, even touched upon it. Like, that was a thing that, like, that would do. And it's so much more real, so much more authentic, and it gets to... Yeah, I'm sorry, I did cut you off when you were trying to make a
No, I thought
point.
that was showing Quatermass. It's not clear. He does have, like you say, a balance. For example, he does offer to give the grape jelly to the authorities as well. Can I have a sample for ourselves for our lab? Sure, go ahead. I mean, so although he wants absolute control, he doesn't really argue in terms of the Allied.
He won't argue with the authorities, but he will. It's kind of a speak softly but carry a big stick.
Right.
So that may actually be the inspiration for this version of the character and what it's doing, and it gets back to that. But yeah, you're right.
Right. So he does have some lenience where even
he doesn't have respect for authority. He has tolerance of it as a means to an end. Like, if it'll get them off his back, he will cooperate with them. But as soon as like the actual going out into the world happens.
Right.
He just pursues.
But I want to point out that point that it's very interesting. You're rooting for good over this blind ambition, which really isn't that blind, of Quatermass. But again, I have to come to the point that if he wasn't overruled, of course there wouldn't be a movie. There may have been a different outcome if the creature had stayed where he was. and not put into the hospital.
I don't know. I think
Because
that's
the
a
wife
cop
has to,
out.
it would happen. But the idea is that it would be harder to write, wouldn't it? I mean, it'd be harder to...
Would it be?
I
Because that's the thing. All that needs to change is that there needs to be, like, something that triggers Karun. Like, if anything, like, you could even say
No,
that
I don't
maybe...
think so. I think you have to
that
have
maybe it potentially makes the problem worse. That maybe in this clinical atmosphere, Karun just is just completely static and becomes consumed by this thing much faster, whereas maybe even perhaps Karun's ability to escape and to get out of the situation allows enough time where he is actively fighting this thing.
But the point is that if Quatermass wasn't overruled, he wouldn't get into the hospital, and the opportunity of the wife to side with some huckster to
right, yeah, that we
should
say that. That's how Karun gets out, is that his wife who
also gets another meal.
Yeah.
Right, because he eats the guy too. Right?
Yeah, she gets some guy to disguise himself as a doctor in order to get Karun out of the hospital, and then Karun escapes once she abandons him because she realizes that he's transforming into a creature.
Look at the film sequence though, how well it was written. It's the time where he hits the lift button to go up. To get him, put him back down again. At the same time, what do we get? A view of a nurse walking to the lift.
Yeah.
Right? And you know she's going to push, she pushes the button for the lift to come back up. In that time, he kills the orderly, the huckster.
Yeah.
Right? The wife opens the door and happens to see him there, wondering what's taking so long. Oh, there you are. Come out.
And doesn't even bother to
find
out. And then the nurse finds the body in the elevator.
It's really a beautifully put together film.
Yeah.
There's some really nice touches in it, I think.
You keep all those pieces moving, and it really keeps your interest in a way that just showing Karun kill the guy does not.
And all these killings are off screen. They're really not deliberate. They're not shown.
It's all implied. But I will say this. I do think it's a cop-out with regards to Quatermass, because while yes, technically the only reason that Karun is out and about is because his wife violates and overrules and surreptitiously overrules Quatermass and springs him from the hospital, ultimately, I'm sorry, who sent Karun into space?
Oh yeah, no, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that it's interesting that this guy is wrong in his blinded ambition and control. But at the same time, he was right here. It's kind of interesting. And again, the writers show this kind of pull. Because any mundane writer would make it look like good versus evil or like a mad scientist that needs to be... But here there's an element where Quatermass is pretty well... He understands. It's a lot of things like we see in life.
He's competent.
He's competent,
and that's something. And that's another thing that just sort of distinguishes the Quatermass experiment, even as it falls into this trope of a corrupted scientist. He's not like the scientist in Kaltiki or from Helen Came, where he's just bumbling into things totally. He has a competency, which means that he is uniquely predisposed to be the person who corrects all the problems that he creates in the first place.
Exactly.
Which I guess that gets back to that he's much more of, like you're saying about the ambivalent characterization of him, he's kind of an anti-hero.
He is.
We acknowledge
That's a very good point. Anti-hero is a good term for it.
We acknowledge all of his personal, ethical, and sort of pathological failings.
Yes.
But at the end of the day, we're forced to reckon with the horror that, like, damn it, the same person who got us into this mess is probably the only person who's going to be able to get us out of it.
You've done this to him. He'd have been better off if he'd been killed or stayed out there.
Judith.
You've destroyed him like you've destroyed everything else you've touched.
Destroyed him, I brought him back. I've saved him.
Saved him for what? For further experiments? I can help him more than you or anyone else can.
There's no room for personal feelings in science, Judith. Some of us have a mission. You should be very proud to have a husband who's willing to risk his life for the betterment of the whole world.
What world? Your world? The world of Quatermass.
Karun finally, loses his fight with the monster that's transforming him. He becomes this great basically the blob monster. He becomes this
Well,
big...
no, it's more like an octopus
It's
with
like
an
a
eye,
cephalopodic
right?
plant-like mass.
Yeah.
And it goes into a church and it hides in there as it's about to breed asexually.
Oh, yeah, and there's all kinds of little things. What's that similar to? It's similar to...
It's gonna bud.
The thing from another world.
Yeah, it's like the thing from another world.
Where he's all vegetable. It's vegetable, alive? Yes.
Yeah,
like
a living vegetable.
A living carrot? Yes.
He's going to spore and he's going to spread and he's going to assimilate the rest of the world, and then he is destroyed because they just hook up some he's in like some sort of rafter and they hook up energy to the rafter. They cut literally the power to all of London to convert all of the electricity to just this church.
Yeah.
And then they electrify the creature and kill it. And then, as you're saying, Quatermass just walks out into the night. He doesn't like take the car he came in. He just completely leaves the situation for the rest of the characters to clean up. And then when his assistant asks him, well, what are you going to do now? And he's like, I'm going to do it again.
Is there anything I can do? Yes, Marsh. Gonna need some help.
Help, sir? What are you going to do?
Gonna start again.
He's gonna go ahead and the movie does end. The end title is another rocket as it is being launched.
Really well done. Yeah.
He's a man of his word.
Yeah. So whatever happened, whatever transpired, which would have been a world incident, had no meaning, and it's very apropos for today. It really is that you have reckless people.
It's this. It's this sort of pursuit of knowledge at the expense of all basic ethical concerns. Like Quatermass is this archetypal scientist character who sees knowledge as an end in and of itself, but there's no real dwelling upon what the material benefits of this knowledge would be. And in fact, I would say it's interesting in casting Quatermass as this sort of brutish American, almost general-like figure, there is a certain subtextual suggestion that this is almost about the chauvinism of American space race and American technological races and sciences, that, like, this isn't really about knowledge. This is about blasting this rocket and being the first and being the one to dominate space and all of this stuff. It's not really about progress at all or anything that is going to materially help people.
Well, I think what's really interesting that this character, and I think and the way the writers embody this individual, not once do you see this guy run. There are two almost shots of him just walking into the church, checking everything out, walking out. And the shot is very, very similar to almost Feet Up. So you see this towering person, just walking with his hat on, or whatever, I guess it's a Hamburg he's wearing, whatever he has. And he's walking. And again, it illustrates what you said, this sort of like the mass power that this individual has.
Yeah, when he's walking off into the night at, the last time we see him, it's almost like a noir film.
Yes.
It's almost like we're watching a private detective or someone. That is like the dominating duality of this narrative, which is, on the one hand, there is the technical monster, which is what Karun is being transformed into, and on the other hand, there's Quatermass, who is the only reason that this monster has been brought back to Earth in the first place. In terms of how it's expressed in the film thematically and aesthetically, it illustrates perfectly how, again, that, the Quatermass Experiment is not only a groundbreaking film for the time, it's also a very effective exemplar of a particular moment in genre filmmaking.
Yeah, genre, absolutely.
Because technically speaking, it is a science fiction space race movie. It has all the exploitable elements of what was popular at that time, which is it's no longer monster stars. It's no longer like Dracula or Frankenstein or Wolfman. It's monsters themselves as these kind of flamboyant, spectacular creatures that are constantly growing and mutating. It's stuff from space. It's stuff about the bomb. It's stuff about invasion.
Right.
But the Quatermass Experiment itself, stylistically, is much more akin to a classic gothic horror movie. You know, and we got into this in the case of Kaltiki, where the distinction between a monster movie per se, as they were becoming popular, especially in the United States at this time, and gothic horror, is that the tradition of gothic horror is to emphasize the concept of monstrosity itself as this thing that disturbs the natural order or mutilates the soul or the minds of people, these things that take away their agency. So it is, I think the Quatermass Experiment is such a beguiling and effective film, because even though we see a monster, and it's a very effectively made monster, like there's one part where a part of Karun's body, which has come off of him after when he leaves the hospital, it slowly grows inside Quatermass's lab and eats the mice, and tries to eat the mice that are there, but dies before it can get to them.
Right. It dies of starvation, which is a very good point, because a lot of these pictures of blob-type nature, you really only get a sense of how they grow to their size.
That like it could just stop. Like that is the thing. It's like, so it, and it's very effective to show that point that, okay, the creature can starve to death, so there is still a possibility that Karun, if some element of his psyche remains,
right,
some element of his desire to remain human and not become this thing, he could kill himself.
Right. And
he could do something. He could just go out and like a Bill Burr, the comedian, would say, go out in a field and bleed out like a gentleman, like a British gentleman. But anyway, yes, that is the sort of emphasis of the film. And just like how the implied stuff and the gothic horror makes the explicit content more effective,
or like an Orson Welles kind of shooting.
The emphasis,
it's got that Citizen Kane.
There's definitely an Orson Welles, like a low budget Orson Welles stuff. That's the thing. Val Guest's direction of this movie is very cool, and he talks about this in the audio commentary of the movie, that his initial idea was to do it much more cinema verite. He wanted much more handheld camera. He wanted it to be in much more documentary style. That doesn't quite translate in the film as it exists, but there's lots of stuff like overlapping dialogue in the film that is happening at a time when very few filmmakers, especially in this genre, were doing it.
The creature, the thing from another world, there's a lot. I love
there's also overlapping dialogue.
I love the overlapping dialogue.
So there's definitely parallel thinking among certain
that's
directors.
An American film.
Yeah, that is an American film.
But unfortunately, I don't think any American film touches the greatness of this one.
It's just it's
in
just
terms of its whole,
all the elements working together, and this is what I mean with regards to the monster. The fact that there is so much more emphasis on the gothic subject of monstrosity, of Karun as a character transforming, makes the monster that much more compelling. And I particularly think of, you noted that the monster isn't just a blob. It has like an almost octopus-like eye.
Right.
But here's the thing. There's like a close-up that Val Guest gives of the eye of the monster as it's being killed. And when the monster is being killed, the shriek that it gives out is so humanoid.
Right.
You get this impression, and it's so authentic. It's not just like a creature that's roaring and then it dies out. There's something human in that voice. I wasn't clear
whether that was actually squeaking or just the sound of the electricity. But
no, that's the monster screeching.
Yeah, so that goes to show you how...
You know, Guest had a very consistent vision in terms of making sure that the monster was not just a spectacle unto itself, that even when it attains this spectacular form at the climax, the focus is still that in that creature is a man. In that creature is Karun. And ultimately, what that makes the ending about is this is just Quatermass finishing the job he started when he sent Karun into space in the first place. He is the person that kills Karun. And
I think and the touches are just what, like they I mean, in terms of the transformation of the individual, you know, the only scene that I remember that shows the, what would you call, larval stage between those and the more mollusk-like structure at the end, was the one shot of the part of the head and eyes looking through the, before it attacked the animals. You get this close-up where...
Oh, yeah, Karun, before he's transformed, he's hiding in the bushes.
But his face, his face has changed, yeah.
Yeah, just enough of his face that you can see that his skin is disintegrating, something is starting to break out, and he's just spying on these animals as he's about to prey on them.
So there's really, like I said, there are all elements in the film that are remarkably... You look
and
at
so efficient.
Yes,
there's not a single wasted moment.
No,
is
there
there?
isn't. There is not.
Even things that you would think would be extraneous, because we have to talk about this one scene. Would you like to talk about a certain lady?
Oh.
Would you like to talk about Rosie?
Rosie.
Who's Rosie, Dad?
Hands off me, young man. Please remember that I come here of my own accord.
Yes, yes.
I come here to complain about something what I saw.
Okay, Rosie, you keep saying that.
I refuse to divulge it to any common constable who has nothing else to do all day but sit on his big flat fleet.
Well, Rosie's the one that saves the day, doesn't she? She reports that...
Okay, well, tell us, how are we introduced to Rosie? Who is Rosie? Really, let's get it down.
Rosie is a homeless alcoholic.
Mm-hmm.
A lovable homeless alcoholic.
Are you saying that this is in the midst of this incredibly morbid movie, there's this extended comedy relief scene that doesn't ruin it?
No, it doesn't.
So what happens? What does Rosie do once she gets to the police?
It's remarkable. First she shakes him down for an extra shilling so she can get her booze.
My voice went so dry that I couldn't even yell for a copper. I still got this awful thirst. Makes it hard to remember. And water makes me as sick as a baby.
It better be worthwhile, Rosie. After you tell me.
It's suggested that this has been done many times before, that it's typical for Rosie to come...
She lies where she's living, puts down, yes, Salvation Army, go ahead. Or whatever it was.
Yeah, she lies that she's living with her, I think her sister, and then the cop just says Salvation Army. And, it's like, on one level, it does fit perfectly with the morbidity of the film, doesn't it? Is that, like, of all the characters to, like, be someone finally coming forward and saying, yeah, I've seen this weird thing, it's this person who is completely motivated by something totally extraneous, where they are a person who has a debilitating dependency on alcohol.
The officers are kindly incredulous, but not completely incredulous that they don't accept. For example, they're not the police people, that one police guy in the Blob, that can't be convinced that the students or kids are...
Sergeant Bird.
Sergeant, which is interesting.
We'll get to that later.
Whereas this cop said, what did you see? He said, I saw something crawl up the... And they knew right away that this is probably something that needs to be reported.
Well, they know from Scotland Yard that they are.
Exactly.
Because we should say, like,
everybody's in contact. You mean it wasn't a Jinn goblin? No, Rosie, I think you saw something real. And she faints.
Walking? It was kind of crawling. Up on a wall. Wasn't like any of the things that I'll see on Saturday nights.
No, Rosie, I think this time you really saw it. Get me in the yard. Or cancel it. This is priority.
Really saw it? You mean that this time it's not it's not a Jinn goblin?
No, Rosie, this time it was real.
Real? It's my legs!
Even the most extraneous, sort of tangential aspect of the movie is delivered in such a concise and terse way where nothing is wasted, and and it helps the story, and it goes back to what you were saying about the different elements of the scene where Karun kills the guy who's breaking him out of the hospital while they're in the elevator, and using the nurse as a sort of pawn in that scene in order to reveal the shock. Keeping all of these subtle elements working together, you give the impression of something that's far more complicated and thus keeps you more interested than it actually is. How long was
that? 3 minutes at the most? I don't think it was that long.
Yeah, it was one and done. Yeah. I mean, the whole movie's only 78 minutes.
It's absolutely remarkable. It looks like it's longer. It feels longer.
There's so much packed into so little.
Yep.
Obviously, there's some similarities between the Black Sleep and the Quatermass experiment. The number one being that even more so than the Quatermass Experiment, The Black Sleep is kind of it's a movie that is, again, starring Lon Chaney, John Carradine, Basil Rathbone, Bela Lugosi. This movie that is premised so much on showing these big-name horror stars in the advertisement at a time where that sort of technique was becoming increasingly less essential than putting a monster, whether it's from space or whether it's an atomic mutant or something, up front and center. It's an atypical film for the time because it is a gothic horror movie.
Yes.
And like the Quatermass Experiment, it is this interstitial film between trends. It is a gothic horror movie, but it is also plainly science fiction.
But this is galvanism. Luigi Galvani experimented with the effects of electricity on animal nerve and muscle as far back as 1760 or thereabouts. And only 70 years ago, Professor Aldini experimented on the body of a man executed for murdering his wife and child. But again, these investigators didn't go far enough. And no one has ever worked on an exposed brain, to my knowledge. Let's continue. Scalpel.
The Black Sleep opens with a man he's going to be hanged for a murder that he didn't commit. He's a character named Dr. Gordon Ramsay, who is played by Herbert Rudley. And what happens is that Basil Rathbone's character, Sir Joel Cadman, he tells him basically of a plan to spring him from jail, which is that he's going to give him this Indian drug, which is going to replicate the symptoms of someone who is deceased.
The ancients who wrote in the Sanskrit tongue gave first mention of the strange drug we call Nimdandhera. This drug was first introduced into the city of Lahore in the Punjab in the 703rd year after the death of the Prophet, praise his memory. This drug has the power to place a man's body and limbs into helplessness, and his soul sleeps, nor does he feel pain. He is as a dead man, yet is not of the dead.
And then basically Cadman uses this to induct Ramsay as an assistant in his experimental brain surgeries. And
so we have to be brief, but for sake of the time, should we say that he was actually blackmailed by him?
Yeah.
He actually used the Odo.
Yeah.
Probably struck him from behind. In other words, it's all...
Here's the thing. As we later find out, the twist is Cadman is the one who abducted the man that Ramsay was accused of killing.
Right.
And it turns out that the man that Ramsay is accused of killing is in the dungeon of Cadman's castle. He was another one of these people who has had his brain completely mutilated by Cadman's experiments. I mean, on one level, Cadman is less interesting than Quatermass because he's a much more transparently, megalomaniacal,
absolutely
mad scientist trope.
He's a trope.
Right.
Yeah, whereas Quatermass is not a trope.
Right.
I mean, Quatermass is an interesting character, but
this
guy is just clearly
right. Whereas in another way, there's no cop out as there is with Quatermass, where obviously Quatermass isn't responsible for the fact that this rocket intercepts some alien force that starts transforming Karun. In the case of the Black Sleep, and what's so interesting about Cadman's characterization in this movie is that it's not entirely unsympathetic either. He's obviously crazy and megalomaniacal, but his pursuit of this thing is not as abstract as Quatermass's is. No. He's not just...
It's very overt.
Right. If anything, Quatermass's whole thing, knowledge. This is the reason that Karun and other people like him are expendable, because the pursuit of knowledge overcomes all. If anything, Cadman attempts to appeal and sucker in Ramsay through that line, that this is about the pursuit of knowledge, this is the sacrifice that needs to be made. But then what becomes revealed is that no, his motivations are much more straightforward. He wants to bring his wife back to him.
She is alive. Angelina, age 33, the prime of life, struck down by malignancy of the brain. Angelina Cadman, who's been in a coma now for over 8 months, waiting a cure. I won't let her die. She is my wife. You think it's been easy, Dr. Gordon Ramsay, to live with this? To take men and turn them into those things? I who've been knighted by my queen for my achievements in surgery. Doctor, I would put my knife into the brains of 100 men, 1,000, and destroy them all, if I could restore her to me for only one day.
The guy is clearly unhinged.
Right.
His pursuit of trying to save his wife, to practice on the brains of all these people in the hope of getting his wife out of this coma, is just...
Whereas Quatermass is very obscure. We don't really know.
Like I said, I think it's a compilation of all the things that can go wrong with power.
Ayn Rand has kind of become almost, she's a infamous figure because she's an author of such books as The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, and also the progenitor of a philosophy that is now referred to as Randian objectivism. And, Ayn Rand, in both her nonfiction and her fiction writings, she very stridently espoused the value of rational empiricism, the idea that there is only the material world, there is nothing spiritual, there is no spiritual dimension to reality, that everything can be understood through our critical faculties and attention to empirical evidence, but also a belief in the pursuit of beauty and knowledge as the highest things that human beings can strive for, and also that strident individualism, and even kind of a hyper-individualism, an individualism divorced from any consideration of what the concerns of society are altogether, is the only way that we're going to reach those heights. Mm-hmm. Obviously, from a certain political perspective, Ayn Rand's, her philosophy has been very influential on the evolution of the modern right, especially the sort of libertarian elements of the modern right.
No, laissez-faire capitalism. I mean, they're very selective in what they take from her.
Yeah, right? Exactly. They're very selective of what they take from her, so that it becomes...
Paul Ryan he used that as the basis.
Right. And we should emphasize that, and this isn't a defense of Ayn Rand, but I will say that, Ayn Rand was not, again, the point of The Fountainhead is that this guy is willing to starve in order to not compromise himself. It's not about making money.
Right.
It's not just a means to an end. She really did espouse the idea that even laissez-faire capitalism, to a certain extent, was too authoritarian and collectivist for Ayn Rand. She believed that the only way for people to truly actualize their full potential, and for the best people, she was, inherently elitist. She believed that the only way for them to truly actualize their best selves was to extricate themselves entirely from concerns with the public, or questions of our collective responsibilities, or questions of whether there is a higher moral law which can't be extrapolated from observations of the material world. And the reason I sort of gave that long-winded explanation is because when I watch the Quatermass experiment, I see in Quatermass a very vivid representation of a Randian protagonist, but through a lens which is critical of that character, and illustrates that it sort of depicts how, though, that idea of, achieving knowledge or beauty being the highest virtue, of the primary importance of allowing individuals to actualize themselves at any cost to the collective. I think the Quatermass experiment does illustrate in a kind of satiric way how that actually translates into a material crisis. because you had mentioned before, and we had talked about before, there's really this confusion of how Quatermass has any authority at all. Like, what is an American scientist doing in the UK making rockets, and apparently, like, no one has the authority to stop him, or at least never tries.
The main films that he could be a composite of both industry, government. So I think he represents, because he has such power, he has such connections to here and there. So I think that he represents this blind's the wrong word.
You know, if I ever gave them all the facts, you'd find one or two of them difficult to explain.
Don't try and drag me through the mud, Blake. You might splash a little bit on yourself, you and your committee.
You deliberately launched that rocket without waiting for official sanction.
If the whole world waited for official sanction, it'd be standing still. You took too long. I made my own decision.
To gamble with 3 men's lives.
Every experiment is a gamble. The unknown is always a risk. They should know that.
Did she know that? That woman over there, waiting, hoping, and praying?
It's dropped another 100 degrees since we arrived.
Still got a long way to go.
Let's hope that insulation lining doesn't crack up.
Yes, let's hope it didn't, because if it did, Quatermass, and those 3 men in there are
Dead
dead.
or alive, they'll be heroes.
Are you all right?
Let me tell you something, Blake. They'll fire the imagination so that there'll be 100 men begging for the same privilege when we launch the second rocket. You can't stop it now.
The lack of checks and balances here wouldn't have prevented from what happened. The spaceship went into space. It intersected a being that's floating in space that assumed a form that came down to Earth. That's not, irrespective of whether Quatermass could have all the great intentions in the world.
Okay, but then
and he could stop flying if he wanted to, but it wouldn't have changed the incident. What changes the fact that he's going to go back into space again.
Right. Well, that's the thing, isn't it? He has his experiences, and that's why I say it's pathological, because his experience doesn't register in any way in the sense of
informed him.
Right, it hasn't informed him.
We're
not really given a window.
Right,
into
we don't know
mind.
whether we could build. I mean, one of the scenes we see is that in the film, which I think is very interesting, because it maybe gives you the forerunner of what really happened when the spaceship goes off at the second time, when at the closing. When they're in the spaceship, he says, "Look, the prism worked," and it cut to the control panel.
Yeah, we should mention that, like,
there's some finer things here, which it makes.
There's a scene in the film in which they review the flight log footage from the inside of the capsule. And, you know, honestly, I'm going to say it. Despite the fact that we referred to how it influenced the found footage scene in Kaltiki, which was very prescient for the time in terms of its use of handheld camera, I'm going to go ahead and say I think the found footage stuff in the Quatermass experiment is a lot more atmospheric and effective, because there's a lot less talking, and I love how, like, it cuts in and out at certain moments, and Quatermass says it's programmed to stop at specific intervals.
Right.
So there's all these missing pieces of information.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But you were saying with regards to that, I'm sorry.
Well, I'm saying that to me it sounds like he may have figured something out. That maybe the spaceship that's going up again has the elements that could prevent. See, he seems to be too much of a controlled character to just say he's just going to, through dalliance, he's going to go back up there again and maybe risk the same problem, which almost affected the entire world.
See, this is the thing.
I give him more credit than that. And I think that one scene about having the prism switch to the control panel indicated that he was thinking about different things within his ship.
Well, look, he's making manned rockets in the late 50s, which was something that nobody else was doing besides the Soviets successfully. So obviously he's a very intelligent guy. It's part of the contrivance of the plot. But honestly, I think it does speak to this really inherent problem with Quatermass as a character, and the crisis that he poses within the narrative, is that we are forced to depend upon the idea that he, no matter what problem he encounters, he will be able to make some adjustment or reform that is going to fix it, that the next rocket he sends up is going to be the one that's impervious to alien insemination. But here's the thing, I don't like the idea that I have to be dependent upon this pathological narcissist.
Oh, no, I agree.
Who again, the arc of the movie is that he just treats Karun as a test subject, as a way to extract knowledge. He's completely disengaged from any authentic empathy with human beings.
I suppose you're right. I suppose you're both right. He does belong in a hospital. But can a hospital do more than you can do? Would a hospital know what goes on out there in space, on the other side of the air? There's a whole new world out there, a wilderness, uncharted. And he's been there and come back. He's got the map. Unlock his mind for me, Briscoe, and find it. I know you can do it.
It isn't just a question
I know the
of...
strain and tension you've been under, but to stop now when we're so close...
But I do want us to speculate on how someone like Quatermass could emerge, because we were confused about how precisely he has the authority that he has, but it seems rather straightforward. Well, he has the authority that he has because someone has given it to him.
Right.
That despite the fact that he's not working for the government, presumably, like these are his own private experiments.
Well,
that's why he's able to say, I'm going to do it again, rather than, well, it's going to be much harder to submit my second proposal for rocket number 2. You know, he just goes and does it. So, but he has the authority. So the impression that I got was that he's almost like a private contractor.
Yes.
That the government has outsourced the
That's what it
endeavor.
sounds like.
And so, like, again, that gets back to the idea of him being an anti-hero figure. And I think the inscrutability of where he gets his power, again, it's almost like there's this trail. It starts with Karun as the superficial monster. It goes to Quatermass as this other form of monstrosity, which is much more pathological. But then the monstrosity goes even further, I think, into ideology. Mm-hmm. It gets into this question of, why does this private actor have so much authority and so much freedom to do all of these things, which we are told are for the benefit of all mankind, but really all of the gains are Quatermass's. All of the gains that come out of this are private, because it's all about him proving to himself that he can do these things, and that he can, like, be the shoulder, he can shoulder the duties of the highest achievements of man, whereas all of the consequences, all of the costs remain public. They all get externalized onto these people who just die. You know, it's like all these things, you know,
right.
Like, you know, the rocket might as well have crashed into the middle of Soho and killed a bunch of people, and we would be asking the same question. How did you lose contact with the rocket? How did it crash into London? What are you going to do now, Quatermass? I'm going to send another rocket. Right. It's like, you just killed a bunch of people. You can't just say you're going to just go ahead and build a rocket.
I mean, there are some, you know...
And again, it's like, that's the thing. It's like, I understand why you're giving him credit, because in a certain way, we have to give him more credit, because that's the contrivance of the story. He is capable.
Well, the idea is, I give him credit because I can't believe, and that's maybe the problem, that we can stray that far. But given today, I have no doubt that this could happen. And
I realized that I kind of got a little bit far away from, wait, how does Ayn Rand's philosophy relate to this? What I mean is that Quatermass himself is that Randian character, but far from what Rand envisioned, where that person is just like this beautiful hero who can just disentangle himself from society. The real problem is precisely this ideological fantasy that this Atlas figure exists in some sense. Right. That you can... This Randian hero is always part of society, so therefore anything that he does in the pursuit of this beauty and knowledge, you know, when Atlas shrugs, the sky is going to collapse on us. Like, that's the... Like, what a horrifying thing to title your book, is like, oh, Atlas, the hero, is going to shrug off the world? Right. Then what happens to the world? And so that's what I mean. It is in one way a satire of Randian objectivism, I think. I don't know if it was intentional, but it works that way. But in a broader way, it's a satire of just the incredible leniency that the public and, you know, we as voters give, you know, our elected representatives our power to give away.
That's not true. 85% of the people are for gun control. 90% want to see things done with the environment.
Right.
And we have
we
have elected officials that still vote in the opposite.
Yeah.
So we've lost control.
We're so beaten down and exhausted by all this stuff. But that's what I'm saying. I think it's more than just a satire of that Randian hero. I think the Quatermass experiment really works. Like we're saying, just consolidating all of the stuff we've praised about the movie, I think it really does work as during the 50s, during this period of Cold War paranoia and this military industrial expansion and the space race and all of these other things, it really is a wonderful parody of how even something as simple as just a liberal democratic contracting out of, supporting private enterprise in the service of like a good that's supposed to help, they're supposed to elevate the rest of society or like trickle down or something, inevitably just deleteriously leads to this monstrousness, like this internal corrosion.
That's true. Yes. Right.
And I think we could even say the same thing about the Black Sleep, couldn't we? Because, at least in the sense that I think Basil Rathbone's character, Cadman, it's such a much more honest, because that's where the mask falls away, doesn't it? It's no longer about the pursuit of knowledge or beauty. It becomes straightforward. No, he's just a selfish rich guy living in his castle with a bunch of prisoners and the mutilated slaves. It's like there is that dimension there too, and I'm wondering if you felt that there's like a dimension of like him living, like, why do all these mad scientists have castles?
Quatermass doesn't have that kind of thing.
Right, exactly.
It isn't clear what profit he gets from it.
Yeah. Well, he gets again, it's like that's the Randian part. That's what I'm saying, is like he gets that self-actualization, but with a more...
What this guy does, this guy's self-actualization isn't really there. What he's trying to do is he's crazy. He's trying to save his wife, and he's doing these brain experiments to save her.
Right. But here's the thing.
There's a big difference between the two.
No, I know there's a big difference, but I do want... But just to emphasize why Quatermass is such an exceptional version of this trope, and kind of a subversive version of the trope, with the Black Sleep, and again, with all of the scientists... Where do they get these giant houses?
Like, well, they're rich.
But why are they so rich?
Because that's the way they are. In England, back in the 1800s, doctors look at the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The guy lived in a mansion.
Well,
right?
look at freaking Frankenstein. Why did they always live in castles? There's just no... Like, the only mad scientist I know who just lived in a humble apartment was the Invisible Man. The rest of them of these classic Gothic periods,
right.
It's not, and that's the thing, is that, like, I think we began by, you admitted that you have, like, a certain, not a resentment, but you have a certain annoyance at the way these films, there's almost like a scientophobia, like an irrational fear that the scientific process is, we're tampering in God's domain, we're going to yield these terrible outcomes. But I think what we see in the Black Sleep and the Quatermass experiment, I just sort of realized, no, the problem isn't science. The problem is, number one, the political establishment.
Checks and balances.
Number two, wealth. Mm-hmm. It's like these things, like I never really had stopped to question, wait, how can Dr. Frankenstein just get bodies and just how can someone like Odo be hired by this guy to fucking deliver human specimens to him? And how can they operate this on the down low? Oh, I know how. He's freaking rich. That's how he can do it.
Right.
I'm sorry you saw fit to explore. Poor judgment on your part. I wanted to spare you this
torture chamber? Why do you keep these people chained to the wall like animals?
The hour has come. Rise up and murder our torturers!
In the name of humanity, you must do something for them.
What happens to them is unimportant. They've served my purpose.
I feel like, I just feel like this was a good double feature. The Quatermass experiment was obviously a lot better, but like, where do you think the Black Sleep sits among the...
It's pretty good. It's a good film.
It's pretty good.
I thought it was good.
Yeah. We've been talking forever. What have we learned today, Rocco?
Well, you know, son, it goes without saying, but I guess I'll say it anyway. Crime simply does not pay. And following from that, the only true monster is man.
Anything else?
Not really, no. I guess we're...
Okay, that'll do it for today, everyone. Thank you for listening to Monster Craze.
Wait. I've got a closing bit that I could... Yeah, I think that's something that works.
Yeah, you got one?
Yeah. Let me think.
You said you had it.
I know. Well,
Did the train already leave the station?
I'm trying to put it into words, if you let me. Science, as we understand it, Western society is not value neutral. That's one thing we can say. There is no apolitical science. It is all affected and deeply informed by some kind of ideology. That's the other thing. If you look at any of these films, there's something more subversive than the actual science. Science has been hijacked. Quatermass hijacked science for his own ego, or whatever we call it, with a pursuit of whatever. And the same thing in the case of the Black Sleep.
Well, damn.